With Final Fantasy 16 on the horizon now, I want to give my thoughts on Final Fantasy 10. And the reason why I want to give my thoughts on this is because the other day on Twitch, I was streaming a little bit of Final Fantasy 4 Ultima Edition, which is a hack of the SNES slash Super Famicom version of Final Fantasy 4. Final Fantasy 4 is my favorite Final Fantasy game. Is it the best one? Probably not, but it's my personal favorite. I have a lot of memories with it. I cherish and love the characters in the story. I think it has the best characters in the story. Not the best villain. I would say 6 gets that. 6 is probably the best overall game. But in the chat, there were some conversations about what everyone's favorite Final Fantasy was, and Final Fantasy X popped up a lot, and I've seen a lot of people say that. So I want to give my thoughts on Final Fantasy X because I have a bit of a different opinion on it. So, Final Fantasy IV was my first Final Fantasy, and then I played 6, and then I played 7, 8, and 9, because then we started to actually get them in the US consecutively. But when Final Fantasy X came out, I did not play that on PS2 when it first came out. That was not my original playthrough of the game. It wasn't until much later that I played it. And it was because I felt like, based on everything I had seen, the aesthetics of the game seemed a bit wonky. It looked a little too much like Final Fantasy VIII as far as how the characters looked, but and Final Fantasy VIII had a really weak storyline, if you ask me. I'll do a video on that someday if you want, but I kind of stayed away for a while, but eventually I got around to playing it. And there's a lot of things that I like about Final Fantasy X, but I do feel that it's a tiny bit overrated, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. One thing I will say about Final Fantasy X is that it's the last traditional turn-based Final Fantasy game of the mainline series, because with Final Fantasy 11 it was an MMO, which again, that's not traditional, but it is. I never played 11. I never got around to it. I don't even know if the servers are still up. I'm sure somewhere there's a server up. And then 12 was more like a standalone MMO style, but it still had somewhat of a turn-based system, the ATB system. And then 13 and upwards kind of had. Well, 13 was kind of turn-based, but they kind of went more so the 12 route. So, from then on, Final Fantasy became more of an action RPG type of game. Now, I loved Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I look forward to Rebirth as well. I genuinely do look forward to it, but when it comes to 10, it is, to me, the last classic Final Fantasy. I think that there's definitely a divide, because with every Final Fantasy, they experiment, obviously, but I feel like with 10 is when they really really moved on to the next generation. Then we have, of course, 14, which is an MMO and very popular, very, very good. And I have not played 15 because I heard mixed things on it, and I have other games on my agenda. Now, before playing Final Fantasy X, I was able to play through the first 9 Final Fantasies. So I did go back and play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Obviously, I had already beaten 7, 8, 9 when they had come out, but I did go back, and there's something about the first 5 Final Fantasies with that classic look, that classic story, swashbuckling adventures. I do miss that about the Final Fantasy series. Then it kind of became this sort of more leaning towards the futuristic perspective, and not like classic, heroes and princesses and all that stuff. And that's fine, because Dragon Quest stuck more to the whole swashbuckling medieval style while still being Japanese. When it comes to Final Fantasy X, the storyline hooked me right away. I think the opening of the game immediately hooks you. There's an attack, you don't know what's going on. Then you find out about Spira, you find out about Sin, you get to meet some of the characters. Interestingly enough, this is the first Final Fantasy game that did not have a traditional world map. And at first, I was very against this. At one time, I was a JRPG purist. And I still am a JRPG super fan, but not having a world map is weird. You gotta understand, for somebody like me who's played games that have world maps, even Pokemon, which is only one region, but it was still a map, an overworld map, not having one is just unusual for me. So when I first played it, it was definitely a change of pace. I think the strongest thing about Final Fantasy X, what I really like about it, is I really do like the characters. And yeah, the dub for the original game was a little off, but I really like Tidus is a likable protagonist. A little weird at times, but likable. Auron is my favorite character. For me, Auron is the Vincent of Final Fantasy X. He's that cool swordsman, mysterious guy. He even wears red, kind of is kind of aloof, kind of mysterious, an enforcer type. Those characters really, really work. And Yuna is also a likable character. I felt like the romance between Titus and Yuna was, in my opinion, way better because it wasn't as forced as the Squall and Rinoa relationship from Final Fantasy VIII, right? It felt more natural. It felt more like genuine, I really loved, and I know this is controversial because I'm sure some people don't agree with this, but again, there's this thing called an opinion, and it is what it is. I liked the progression system in Final Fantasy X. I liked the sphere grid because it was different. And granted, there's some things that were different that I didn't like, and then some things that were different that I thought were refreshing. And I really liked that sphere grid because it allowed, kind of more of a customization of how your characters, what direction you want them to go in. And I liked that. Now, what I did not like about Final Fantasy X was that I felt that the combat was a bit too... It was very rock, paper, scissors type. Like, you're facing off against an enemy, and after you beat the enemy, you know which of your characters is going to do the best against that enemy, so you swap them in and out. And it makes fights drag on longer, but it also makes them be less fun. I miss the day when, and obviously there's still games you can do this, where you can take a wizard and just launch spells at your opponent and knock them out, which you can still do in this game, don't get me wrong, but it feels like it's structured more for this kind of rock, paper, scissors mentality, which I did not like. I felt like the combat needed a bit more to it. Now what I did like is how they treat the summon spells. Summon spells in every game have a slightly different way of going about it. You had Materia in 7, you had Espers in 6, you had the Guardian Forces in 8, which I think the GFs were probably the best thing about 8, in my opinion. I liked the Guardian Forces. I liked junctioning, even though it was flawed. The idea I thought was a good idea. And I love the animations. When you get to 10, you have it on PS2 and not PS1, so you have a big graphical leap. So, the further along you go in Final Fantasy, the more impressive and, in some ways, awesome these summon spells look. I mean, Final Fantasy 13 is not a very good game, in my opinion. It's definitely a below average game, in my opinion. But the graphics and the way that the summons look in that game is great. I like how they work in this game. I like how you can customize how they battle. You can even customize them individually. It was cool. There's some good ideas here. Now, I want you to understand, I'm not saying that I don't like this game. I think the worst thing about this game is those damn minecart levels. Those mini games where you have to go through and in the little minecart you have to move left and right or whatever in that little I can't stand those puzzles. They slowed the game down. They were not fun. I didn't like that. Also, I'm not a big fan of Blitzball, and I know some people out there are. I think it's a matter of personal taste, I think it comes down to that because while I was a big fan of the Final Fantasy VIII card game, I didn't like the Final Fantasy IX card game. I didn't even play it. I mean, I played it. I didn't like it. Didn't even try. With the 8 card game, it was way more fun. And in fact, I remember in the early 2000s, there was an online version of that game. I think it's called Triple Triad, right? Where they had Ash Ketchum and Goku and all these non-Final Fantasy characters. I thought it was kind of cool, kind of funny. But when it comes to 10, the mini games here, I'm not a big fan of them. Now I do love the mini games in 7, like the skiing and the strategy game. I love that. 7, I think 7 was the best Final Fantasy when it comes to mini games. I think that one had the best mini games. But the story of Final Fantasy X, when you find out who Sin really is and that the whole, he's a giant monster, it's very different. And I like it. The story of 10 is strong. I'm just surprised. And it has to be, in my opinion, probably because it's a lot of people's first Final Fantasy because it was on the PS2. A lot of folks, this is what I've noticed. when it comes to different generations, a lot of people's first Final Fantasy is either 1, 4, 7, or 10. And I think a lot of that's because each one was the first of its kind on a particular gen. So you had like 1 for the NES Famicom gen. You had 4, which was 2 in America for the Super Nintendo, Super Famicom. Then you had PS1 7, and then you had PS2's 10. But Final Fantasy VI came along and really challenged Final Fantasy IV as far as what the best game on that console is. And I do think Final Fantasy V, I love Final Fantasy V. I love the job system in that game. It's amazing. But 10, I think a lot of people really fell in love with this game when it first came out. I think they did. I love the soundtrack, right? Nobuo Uematsu always delivers. And I feel like with Nobuo Uematsu, from what I remember reading, he's not the only composer. There's like 2 other composers in this game. And I'm not sure exactly what he did. I could probably go look it up. But it's interesting that 10's become this sort of nostalgic, memory for a lot of people. Whereas I feel like 10 was the first game that really, it didn't have the top-down perspective with the world map. It didn't, you had to walk through different areas, sort of like what you do with 7 Remake. Like, it didn't have the same feel of a classic RPG, and they experimented with new things. But I wonder if people, when they first started playing this game, if it's their first Final Fantasy, and if it is your first, leave a comment down below and tell me about it, because I want to know about your memories with this game. But I wonder if maybe they thought that most JRPGs are like that, and then later on they played one that had a world map and were like, whoa, like this is different. It's like the reverse effect of what I played, because I think Final Fantasy VII Remake did the whole lack of a world map thing well, with it being mostly in Midgard, but you could go in between the zones. I mean, it dragged a little bit, but it was still done very good. In this game, and one thing I never got to do in this game, because to me it's not really like a favorite game of mine. It's a good game. I don't think it's a great game, in my opinion. But one of the things that I never got to do in this game is get the strongest weapons and get the secret bosses and beat them. Because I know a lot of my friends tell me how hard they are in this game, and I never got to do that. And maybe someday I'll go back and do it. It's just not on my list of priorities. But I know the super bosses in this game are insane. You would think that Emerald and Ruby weapon and then Omega weapon were going to be like the big, the ultimate super bosses of Final Fantasy. But there have been other ones too, especially in the remakes, the advanced versions, and all the remakes have extra stuff in them. With this game, I've heard bad, like they're really tough. But I like my favorite thing has to be the Aeons. Love that. Like I said, the summons and the characters, especially Ulrich. Like, he's cool. It also has a weird aesthetic too, because like this game has a real like tropical feel to it. And I know it's because a lot of it takes place near the water, like early on. You have Blitzball and you have like these sort of tribalistic clothing. It's a very different aesthetic. And one thing about Final Fantasy X, it looks different from every Final Fantasy. I cannot think of a Final Fantasy that looks like this one. Like, the aesthetic, that is. Now, again, the older games, they all had a different look to them. Somewhat different. But this one has a very tropical... This one is like Pokemon Gen 7. Being on Alola. Like, it has a very tropical vibe to it. The way that Tidus is dressed in, like, shorts. Like, it's very... It feels like a laid-back game. And there were some really epic boss fights, too. There's some real epic boss fights. And I do like Yuna's storyline, too. I love her arc. I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't played it. So, those are my memories on Final Fantasy X. Random video, I know, but I wanted to talk about like what I liked and did not like about the game. It's definitely not my favorite. I like it more than Final Fantasy 2 and 3, the JP 2 and 3. And I like it more than 8. But I don't think I like it more than 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, or 1. Although it might edge out 1. I have a weird thing about Final Fantasy 1 because the NES version is just... I'm not a big fan of it. But the remakes, whether it be the advanced version or the PSP version, is fantastic. So the remakes of those games are great. So I would say, you know what? I would say 10's better than the original one. But the remake of 1, I like it a little bit more. Only a little bit more. I can't say I love it. like to death, but one had, I love the storyline in one, even though it was very simple, and I have a lot of nostalgia for one, and it was the first one. But in some ways, I mean, there's no question 10 is a better game. Not questioning that. But I think there's something about one. I don't know what it is. Maybe just the way it's set up, the lore. It's fun. Anyways, those are my thoughts. Take care, and I'll talk to y'all soon.